Movies are a powerful thing. Some can emotionally devastate you and others can be like the warmest hug you've ever had. Whether it's because they make you feel like a child again and because of how warm and wholesome they are, there are a bunch of movies that I find I return to when I'm feeling low that just instantly pick me up. So I thought it would be a bit of fun to look at some of those movies since I think everyone could use a bit of a pick me up right now because things aren't good. For my first pick, we're going right back to the beginning, to the olden days of cinema, the 1950s, the height of the big budget studio musical. I've always found these musicals to be quite hit or miss, but the absolute granddaddy of them all, Singing in the Rain, absolutely slaps. Directed by Gene Kelly and Stanley Donen, the movie depicts late 1920s Hollywood and the transition from silent film to talkies. Every sequence in this movie is masterfully constructed with incredible choreography, vibrant colours, and an abundance of great songs. The film was conceived by MGM producer Arthur Freed as a vehicle for his catalogues of songs written by Nacio Herb Brown from previous MGM musicals between the 20s and 30s. All of the songs fit in with the narrative of the movie perfectly and are performed incredibly well. The sets and costumes are all fantastic. The film's vibrant, colourful nature may come off sickly for some, but I find it incredibly infectious and enjoyable. There are so many incredible set pieces in the movie, like the insane make 'em laugh sequence that left actor Donald O'Connor bedridden for days after performing. It's one of the most impressive pieces of physical comedy in movie history. But I think on top of all of that, what makes this film hold up so well today is just how funny it is. The film is incredibly satirical of late 20s Hollywood and is filled with jokes that are simple but at times can be surprisingly dark and cynical for its time. Its humor works incredibly well in 2022 and rarely feels dated, something that I think is very uncommon for a movie of its time. This film kind of encapsulates the magic of cinema into 100 minutes. If you don't get any enjoyment out of this movie at all, then you're kinda hopeless. Now let's fast forward 3 decades to a movie that is similarly filled with music. Jonathan Demme's Stop Making Sense. Stop Making Sense is a concert film which shows Talking Heads on their last tour. You may be wondering, why have you put a concert film on this list? Does this really count? Well, I personally think this is one of the most joyful movies ever made. Talking Heads' music is some of the best ever written. I think their music feels incredibly anxious and insulated, showing David Byrne observing and commenting on human nature and the world at large. But this performance takes these songs and as the film progresses, it kind of removes all semblance of anxiety or worry from them. As the film begins, we see David Byrne standing on his own, awkwardly singing Psycho Killer on an empty stage. But as the film progresses, the band expands, the stage setup is slowly built, and by the halfway point, the film feels like a joyous celebration of unity. Everyone comes together and are clearly filled with so much love for what they do. Every band member and dancer having the time of their lives, and it's so much fun to watch. All the performances are incredible, and in many instances, I think the band really perfects these songs in this movie. Out of every concert film I've seen, this is one of the only ones where I've actually felt like I was there. The way Jonathan Demme shoots the performance makes you feel like you're a part of the band. Out of every film on this list, this is probably the one I've returned to the most because it always picks me up. It's my go-to hangover film because by the end of it, I just feel rejuvenated. I even watched it when I had COVID a few months ago and I felt so much energy. It's a truly special movie that is always an absolute pleasure to watch. I'm sure plenty of concert movies or performances could have been put on this list, but this is the one that always stands out to me. But if I was to pick another one, I would probably actually pick David Byrne's American Utopia from a couple years back. I think that basically does everything that this does in a different way, but it's still pretty much just as good. A big place that I find myself regularly gravitating towards when I'm feeling bad is the world of animation. Animation is one of the greatest achievements in the history of cinema. Due to its generally colourful nature, most animated movies are made for families or children, meaning that there are endless amounts of wholesome, heartwarming animated movies, probably more so than live action. So here are just a few animated movies that never fail to put a smile on my face or bring me to tears in a good way. Beauty and the Beast is one of the most beautiful beautiful romance movies ever made. It was one of the landmark movies for Disney, becoming the first animated movie to ever be nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars. Based on the fairy tale of the same name, the film perfectly encapsulates the magic of classic Disney animation while completely revolutionizing the medium and reinventing the entire animation game. Its story is very simple, but it's the perfect backdrop to develop these two characters and their blossoming relationship. While usually an animated movie will have to make a character super cute and cuddly for children to connect with them and care for them, Disney does a great job of making you care about the Beast, a character who is despicable and unlikable when you first meet him, but as the film progresses you slowly fall in love with. The musical numbers are all iconic and perfect. I am unable to listen to the title song without crying like a baby because it's just the most fucking beautiful thing in the world. The animation is breathtaking and has not aged a bit. The animators used early computer animation to enhance many sequences, including the ballroom scene, which is perhaps my favorite sequence in any animated movie ever. This film is just a true tour de force of animation and will always remain one of my all-time favorites. And while we're talking about Disney movies, let's talk about one of the big films of my childhood, Lilo and Stitch. Although this movie is definitely well known and Stitch is one of the most recognizable Disney characters ever, I don't think this movie gets anywhere near the amount of attention that it deserves. It came out in the awkward post-Renaissance era where their movies were kind of hit or miss. I think because of how many misses there were, many people completely write off that entire era despite it containing films like this, The Emperor's New Groove and Treasure Planet, all of which are good movies. Lilo and Stitch is one of Disney's all-time best movies in my opinion. If you're feeling isolated or alone, this film is the perfect comfort, a reminder of the importance of family and also a reassurance that even if you have no one right now, there is someone out there who can come into your life at any point. As a kid who regularly found himself falling out with friends and being completely alone, as I feel like kids kind of do, this movie made everything feel better. It's one of the most charming and heartfelt movies Disney have ever made. The setting of Hawaii helps set it apart and gives it a unique tone and look, as well as its heavy usage of Elvis Presley music throughout, which I feel like that and the setting just kind of sets it apart. There's no other Disney movie or really animated movie that I can think of that feels like this movie. If you've never seen this movie and are worried that it's going to be super sickly and sweet, you'll be happy to know that this movie is actually one of the edgiest movies on this list. The humor at times can be quite dark, but it blends perfectly with the film's tone. The comedy hits super hard and contains some of the funniest moments in any animated movie. About a year or so ago, I rewatched this movie for the first time in years, and my love for it came flooding back. It's great in every way and deserves more attention than it gets. Hell, it didn't even win the Best Animated Feature Oscar that year. Like, are you really telling me that there was an animated movie that came out in 2002 that was better than Lilo and Stitch? Spirited Away was the best animated movie that came out in 2002 and perhaps the greatest Japanese animated film ever made. Multiple Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli movies could have made it onto this list. Kiki's Delivery Service, Princess Mononoke and Howl's Moving Castle are all movies I highly recommend. And My Neighbor Totoro probably should have been put on this list because it's like the sweetest movie ever made. But for me, no movie is quite as magical and enchanting as Spirited Away. The fantasy genre has so much potential for creativity, and with this movie, I think Miyazaki decided to go as far with it as possible. Every second of this movie is filled with stuff that you've never seen before. There is so much vibrance, energy, and fascination throughout this movie. Its dazzling nature reminds me heavily of Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass books. The film beautifully blends elements of pure fantasy with influences from Shinto Buddhist folklore. The whole film has this super spiritual, otherworldly feeling, especially in the film's central location of the bathhouse, where a large variety of folklore creatures frequent. The animation is perfect, and I think some of the most impressive hand-drawn animation I've ever seen. The character designs are so great and memorable. There's a good reason why I've seen dozens of people with no face tattoos. One of my favorite things that a movie can do is fill me with a huge childlike feeling of wonder, and very few movies do that as strongly as Spirited Away. It's one of my all-time favorite movies and one that I can watch endlessly without ever getting tired of it. Also, it's one of like the few anime movies I've seen where the American dub is actually quite good and doesn't take away from the movie at all. So if the language barrier and idea of reading a movie puts you off the film, fear not, because the dub is actually worthwhile. Speaking of all-time favorites, let's talk about my favorite animated movie ever made, Toy Story. Pixar's feature film debut remains one of the most charming, funny, and impressive movies of all time. The film was a true labor of love, going through constant rewrites and complete structural overhauls. Originally planned to be a feature-length version of their short Tin Toy, the film was then made into a buddy comedy before being overhauled again after being considered too edgy. After being rewritten by 4 writers, the film became what it is today. A film that I'll always hold up as an example of a film made for a younger audience that people of any age can enjoy. Although a lot of the animation may not completely hold up, the character designs are so iconic and memorable. The idea of toys coming to life creates endless possibilities that I think the film does a great job of exploring. Randy Newman's score is completely singular, perfectly combining elements of westerns and sci-fi to complement the characters. The sound design is perfect as well. Pixar have always been masters of sound, and this movie perfectly shows that off. The usage of varying sound effects based on the perspective of what we're seeing is just pure genius. It really helps sell the action-packed third act and adds so much depth and drama. And above all, the film is absolutely hilarious. The comedy is so perfect and works no matter what age you are. As well as this movie, its sequel Toy Story 2 is also a genuine masterpiece and may actually be better than the first one. However, that movie does have that scene where Jessie's owner stops loving her, which breaks my heart every time, so that film is not on this list. There are loads of other Pixar movies that I feel like could have been put on here. Monsters Inc., Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Ratatouille, all of those movies are so sweet and filled with warmth and magic. Consider those ones honorable mentions. And of course, if you're okay with putting up with some incredibly heartbreaking moments, Up, Coco and Soul are also really great heartwarming movies, and I think they're probably my 3 favorite Pixar movies outside of Toy Story. By the end of all 3 of those movies, you will definitely be in a better mood and you will feel very warm and happy, but you just have to be okay with being brutally shot in the heart. But for me, WALL-E is about as sweet and wonderful as movies can get. A large majority of the movie is told like a silent movie, taking clear influence from the work of Charlie Chaplin. Pixar does a great job of telling so much story and conveying so much emotion and heart through 2 robots who can't really speak. They use emotional signifiers to show you how the characters feel, somehow making it more effective than if they were to use dialogue. While the movie is a very thought-provoking environmental warning discussing the horrors of consumerism, human waste and corporatocracy, it's also one of the most heartwarming and beautiful romance stories of the 21st century. WALL-E and Eva's relationship is so powerful, and it's impossible to watch this movie and not be completely encapsulated in it. The Chaplin-esque physical comedy in the film's first act is all hilarious with multiple laugh-out-loud moments, and as the film progresses, it just gets even sweeter and sweeter as you see their relationship blossom. In terms of 3D animation, this is practically still the pinnacle and looks breathtaking 14 years later. This is a masterpiece, and I would honestly consider it essential viewing for everyone. While we're on the subject of 3D animated masterpieces, Shrek 2 anyone? While this movie is a funny epic meme, it's also a genuinely great movie. I like the first one, but the second one perfectly expands upon its predecessor, improving upon all of its shortcomings while creating a story that makes sense. The film runs a lot further with the comedy, stripping back a lot of the fairy tale aspects of the previous movie, and is honestly one of the funniest comedies of the past 20 years. Every joke hits incredibly hard and the writing is genuinely genius. The soundtrack is fantastic and there's a good reason why it's constantly referenced to when talking about the movie. The action sequences are also really fun and actually quite exciting, especially in the third act, which is genuinely a fantastic third act. Like, it's one of the best third acts in any animated movie, I think. The film was also nominated for the Palme d'Or at Cannes Film Festival, so how could you go wrong with it? DreamWorks as a studio can be very hit or miss, mostly miss, but they do occasionally put out great stuff. For some reason, they have a habit of making franchises where the second movie is a straight up masterpiece and the others are nowhere near as good, in some instances actually not good at all. We saw that with Shrek 2 and we also saw it with Kung Fu Panda 2. The first Kung Fu Panda movie is fine, as is the third one. It's an alright movie. But the second movie is straight up fantastic. It takes the martial arts aspect of the first movie and massively improves on it to the point where the action sequences are mind-blowingly great. The animation is great and multiple sequences are dazzling to look at. There are a few flashback scenes that are told through 2D animation which look phenomenal, but I think what makes the film so worthwhile is the emotional side of the story. This is a movie that at times does get quite dark and upsetting, which, considering it's a kids movie, is pretty interesting. Never to the point where it's horrible and disturbing, but it definitely has its darker moments, and I feel like because of these darker moments, the film's more wholesome and heartwarming moments later on hit so much harder. There is rarely a point where this film feels like stupid fat panda movie like it does in the other two movies in the trilogy. It feels genuinely genuine and heartfelt and beautiful. Speaking of genuinely genuine, heartfelt and beautiful, How to Train Your Dragon. This is easily the best franchise that DreamWorks have ever made. All three of these movies are great in their own rights, especially the first two, which are two of the best animated movies ever made. I'm putting all three of them on this list because I do think all of them are worthy of it. Although the third one's my least favourite, I think it's still worth noting because it is still a great movie. The animation in all three of these movies is astoundingly good. The character designs are instantly recognisable. The flying sequences are jaw-droppingly beautiful. I will never forget the experience of watching the first movie in 3D in the cinema and feeling like I was actually on the back of a dragon flying through the sky. While at the time people were showing up Avatar and showing that that was what 3D could do and no other movie would ever reach that experience, I looked at How to Train Your Dragon the exact same way. I thought that film kind of captured the feeling of actually flying far better. The trilogy generally is filled with so much wonder and imagination. The medieval fantasy elements add to the movies, especially in their action sequences, which are always really exciting and fun. The action is just consistently great throughout all of these movies. The music captures the epic, heartfelt tone of the trilogy. The films definitely have a comedic edge, but for the most part I think are far more serious than anything else that DreamWorks has ever done. Especially the second and third movies, which both have super powerful moments that never fail to make me cry. The relationship between Hiccup and Toothless is constantly sweet and heartwarming. The first movie focuses entirely on it and it's just so beautiful and sweet. Seeing Hiccup's love for him despite his tribe's hatred of dragons adds a lot of emotional weight to the film, which reaches a great dramatic climax towards the end. I have such a huge soft spot for these movies and cannot recommend them enough to anyone who hasn't seen them. And if you have seen them and loved them and are looking for a film that's kind of similar, I would highly recommend the film Wolfwalkers from Cartoon Saloon. It's sadly only on Apple TV Plus, but it's honestly worth the watch because it's a really fantastic movie. We've talked enough about 3D and 2D animation. Now let's go to a form of animation we've not touched yet: stop motion. Aardman animations are a great example of really sweet and wholesome stop motion animation. Wallace and Gromit is probably their crowning achievement, a cute franchise comprising of a sweet old man and his dog. The series started in 1989 with the short A Grand Day Out, which shows Wallace and Gromit building a rocket and going to the moon to farm for moon cheese. The film started as a graduation project of director Nick Park, taking 7 years to complete. There is an endless charm in the first short due to how rough it is, but also its genuine warmness. Its two follow-up shorts, The Wrong Trousers and A Close Shave, are two of the best masterpieces of animation ever made. Incredibly meticulously crafted and hilarious, they succeed in every single way a film can. They're exciting, they're funny, they're sweet. Nick Park's love of classic movies is shown extensively throughout both these movies, with clearer influence from classic spy movies and British action movies of the 60s. Although the fourth short, A Matter of Loaf and Death from 2008, isn't quite as good as the others, the feature-length Curse of the Were-Rabbit movie is a lot of fun. Inspired heavily by classic horror movies, it's not quite as wholesome and sweet as the original shorts, but it definitely has a lot of charm to it. As does Aardman's first feature-length movie, Chicken Run, a movie that is basically just The Great Escape, but starring the most British chickens ever. My favourite stop-motion movie of all time is easily Wes Anderson's adaptation of Roald Dahl's Fantastic Mr. Fox. Similar to the work of Aardman, the film takes heavy influence from classic cinema. Wes Anderson has always taken huge influence from European cinema from the mid-20th century, and this is shown heavily throughout this movie. Anderson's quirky, vibrant style blends perfectly with the animation style of the movie. The character designs are very striking and have a strange sense of realism to them that definitely creeped me out when the film first came out, but now I absolutely love it. Anderson has always had a penchant for making heartwarming movies, making the idea of him making an animated movie for kids make perfect sense. His eccentric and quirky style fits perfectly with Dahl's story to make something so stylish and skillful. His key eye for visuals, colour and symmetry creates a film that feels like a storybook coming to life. Alexandre Desplat's score is incredibly bizarre yet charming. The characters are all lovable and Anderson injects so much charisma and humour into everything that they do. Wes Anderson is one of my favourite directors and this is one of his best. He completely understands what you can do with animation and uses the format in such a unique and inventive way. I think it's one that adults will get more out of than children, and that's something that I respect about it. Animated movies don't have to just be flashing colours and dumb humour to distract kids for an hour or so. They can tell grand stories, they can be filled with great morals, they can teach and they can create wonder and whimsy, and they can also deliver poignant, powerful and exciting stories that appeal to people of all ages. Animation is one of our greatest art forms and I wish that films like these weren't in the minority. I'm gonna step away from animation now because if I talk any more then this video is just gonna never be done. But just for the sake of it, here's a list of other animated movies that I considered putting in this video. Consider them like honorable mentions or something, I guess. Now that's done, let's talk about a franchise that should not even remotely be considered for this video, but just never fails to make my day better. The Jackass franchise. Jackass is nothing but dumb slapstick and toilet humor. Sometimes it can be funny because of how ridiculous it can be, sometimes it's funny because it's just like watching a Buster Keaton movie with actual consequences, and sometimes it's just flat out gross and disgusting. But the beauty of the franchise is that it's rarely mean-spirited, although the stuff with Bam and his parents is straight up abusive and cringy. Basically everything else has this really weird, sick charm to it. The first two movies feel like a group of young guys getting fucked up and doing dumb stuff. They're basically just party movies, but then you get to Jackass 3D and the recent Jackass Forever, and the franchise becomes weirdly sweet. You're seeing older guys who have been friends for years getting together and reliving the glory days. Although there's definitely moments where they're being massive arseholes to each other, the love that they clearly have for each other can be incredibly infectious. Those last two movies especially feel like you're spending time with old friends, and it's a hell of a lot of fun. Also, there's something about seeing people get hit in the testicles that will just never not be funny. While on the subject of funny, let's rewind to the early 1990s. My parents raised me on a lot of the classic comedies from the 70s, 80s and 90s. Films like Ghostbusters, Airplane, Big, National Lampoon's Vacation and Christmas Vacation, Planes, Trains and Automobiles, The Jerk, Trading Places, the Monty Python stuff. All of those movies were on constant repeat in my house growing up. And although I'll always have a place in my heart for those movies, the one that has only resonated with me deeper and deeper as I've grown older is Harold Ramis's 1993 movie Groundhog Day, the film that completely pioneered the time loop genre to the point where every film that has done it since has just kind of felt like a Groundhog Day ripoff. The beauty of this film is that although it's a vehicle for Bill Murray to show off the cynical, grumpy character he plays in everything, it's also a film that oozes heart and emotion. Somehow a film that contains a scene where Bill Murray kidnaps a groundhog and drives off a cliff in true Thelma and Louise fashion is also one of the most emotionally captivating and powerful movies of the 90s. The film is an incredibly powerful cautionary tale of falling into routine and living life in the most mundane way possible. It shows that although there's nothing wrong with routine, if you don't treasure the little things and live a life of kindness, then every day will be as mundane as the last. While the film may be predictable and formulaic, its optimistic, earnest tone really helps the film work. Harold Ramis was one of the great comedic directors, and this is in my opinion him at his absolute best. Bill Murray and Andie MacDowell are both great in the movie, and their chemistry keeps the film constantly believable. There are moments in this film that have such a profound impact on me every time I watch it. While some may view it as a dumb Bill Murray comedy, I view it as something far more meaningful than that. It's one of the most heartfelt, moving and beautiful movies of its kind. I honestly long for studio comedies like this, but it really does seem like those days are long gone. That year we got another one of my childhood favourite films that's tonally very similar and equally as powerful, Chris Columbus's Mrs. Doubtfire. Robin Williams was one of the all-time great actors. I can't think of any other actor who could just smile on camera and instantly warm your heart. He was such a warm and powerful presence, and Mrs. Doubtfire shows that off for 2 hours straight. The film tackles divorce and the impact it has on a family. It shows Robin Williams playing a character who is filled with so much love for his children and who cares about nothing other than them. However, his lack of maturity is constantly getting in the way of this and kind of working against him. It's a film that on paper should be overly sentimental and emotionally manipulative, and I think a lot of people think it is. But for me, the performances and Robin Williams' unique comedic style makes it completely and utterly genuine. Chris Columbus is a director who generally manages to fill his films with a lot of heart and whimsy. Sometimes it can be too much, but I think Mrs. Doubtfire, at least for me, just about keeps it together. The makeup effects are incredibly well done, and Robin Williams completely transforms into the character of Mrs. Doubtfire. The film is a huge product of its time and does feel very dated, but its story feels timeless. It's a very sweet, heartwarming story, and one that never fails to bring tears to my eyes. Speaking of tears, Merry Christmas everyone! Who doesn't love a good Christmas movie? It's just a shame that most of them are fucking shit. Let's face it, many of the Christmas classics that are on TV every year or that everyone watches every Christmas, they really suck. Elf, Love Actually, The Grinch, they're just all terrible movies. There are probably loads more, but those are the three that really stood out as being bad movies that I know everyone watches every year. But do you know what Christmas classic doesn't suck? The ones that I've picked for this list, because my opinion is the only one that's correct. Hugo is technically a Christmas movie. Martin Scorsese's love letter to early cinema is a heartwarming, magical adventure that I watch every single December. It's an exciting, cheerful fantasy movie that is visually gorgeous in every way. It's easily the most heart-filled movie that Scorsese's ever made, and you can tell throughout just how much love he has put into the movie. The clear love and admiration for the magic and creation of cinema is unbelievably infectious, and by the time it's over, I fall instantly deeper in love with movies. Despite the majority of the film being set inside a train station, the film feels otherworldly. Scorsese really captures the feeling of soaking in a location when you're young, how everything feels gigantic and never-ending despite the fact it's actually a very small, contained location. There's a constant feeling of joy and innocence throughout. Anytime I watch it, I feel like I'm a child discovering movies for the first time. It's a movie that sadly seems to be quite overlooked in terms of Scorsese movies, despite being nominated for 11 Oscars and winning 5 of them. But I honestly think it's one of his all-time best, and although I don't think there's actually a scene where they necessarily celebrate Christmas, it is set in the winter and has that warm, comforting tone that the best Christmas movies have. So, but yeah, it's a Christmas movie. And do you know what else is warm and comforting? Fabric. And you know what's made of fabric? The Muppets, I think. Although I'm only going to talk about one Muppets movie now, I feel like pretty much every single Muppet movie is deserving of a place on this list, except for Treasure Island, Muppets in Space, and Most Wanted, because those movies are really shit. The Muppets are some of the greatest characters ever created. They're so memorable and fun, and I feel like it's impossible to not love them unless you have no heart or are scared of puppets. The Muppet Show and all of the Muppet movies made while Jim Henson was alive are really great. It's pure comedic genius, and the songs are all so memorable and catchy. The Rainbow Connection is honestly one of my favorite songs of all time, and I'm not even ashamed of that. But sadly, after he died, the franchise took a bit of a turn. Disney have tried hard to make the characters feel really modern, especially recently, and it just does not work. However, the Muppet Christmas Carol did the complete opposite. It made them Victorian. The Muppet Christmas Carol works so well, not only because they understand the point of the Muppets, but also because they understand Charles Dickens' original novella. The movie is a straight, faithful adaptation of A Christmas Carol. It just happens to have Muppets playing the side characters. Michael Caine plays Scrooge in probably the best portrayal of the character ever put on film. He's completely and utterly serious and deadpan in the movie, and it's absolutely perfect in the role. Many of the other Muppets play famous characters from the novellas, some of which are completely dry and some of which are just kind of there to add comedic relief to the movie, which although may not be needed, actually does work quite well. It rarely feels out of place, and I think what makes it work so well is that at the same time, they're never afraid to go into the dark directions that the novella does. The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come is genuinely quite terrifying, and his whole sequence is very upsetting, as it should be. It only makes the final scenes of Scrooge's transformation all the more heartwarming and sweet. It's a real shame that the song When Love Is Gone still isn't included in the movie on streaming on Blu-ray, because it's incredibly important to the movie. It was cut due to Jeffrey Katzenberger believing it wouldn't appeal to younger audiences, but it makes the final song of the movie hit so damn hard. But as it is, this is still a really sweet movie. The ending still makes me smile no matter how many times I see it, and it's one of the only Christmas classics that I have watched every single Christmas of my entire life without fail. It's at least far better than that terrifying Jim Carrey mess was. Understandably, A Christmas Carol has been adapted a million times, whether it's a straight adaptation or just something that's kind of loosely based on that story. One of the movies that was loosely based on the story is It's a Wonderful Life, which is one of, if not the best Christmas movie ever made. The movie is a massive roller coaster of emotions, with the first act being really funny and wholesome, the second act making you want to kill yourself, and the third act turning everything around and making everything so much better. Despite it flopping upon release and being a critical failure, it's a film that found its audience years later. Now it's rightfully considered one of the greatest of all time. The film's message is incredibly powerful, telling its audience that everybody matters. Everyone has an impact on the lives of those around us, and everything would be different if we didn't exist. I can understand some people looking at the film's message and considering it trivial, but I find it incredibly powerful and beautiful. Sometimes when you're at your lowest, all you need is someone to remind you of how beautiful life can be. George Bailey is a character who constantly puts himself first before he can't take it anymore and snaps. But the film shows that people are kind most of the time, and if you give to others, you'll find those people are there when you need it the most to pick you up. It's a film about genuine human decency, and it's also an anti-capitalist movie in a lot of ways, making it endlessly timeless. The performances throughout are all great, with James Stewart delivering one of my favourite performances of all time. The editing, score, visuals and writing are all second to none. The film is pure cinematic perfection, and despite being almost 80 years old, has aged horrifically well. Anyway, fuck Christmas, let's go back to the 90s. As I stated earlier in the video, Wes Anderson is one of my favourite directors of all time. One of the things that people never seem to credit him for doing is managing to make melancholy wholesome. The Royal Tenenbaums, The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou, The Darjeeling Limited, Moonrise Kingdom, and The Grand Budapest Hotel are all films that are equally sweet as they are emotionally powerful. So if you're okay with a little bit of sadness, then check out any of those movies. The Royal Tenenbaums is my personal favourite, however is at times unbelievably upsetting, so not one that I'd recommend to everyone. However, one that never fails to cheer me up is his sophomore movie Rushmore, a film that is probably the closest we've ever gotten to a Catcher in the Rye movie. Its anarchic, eccentric coming-of-age story is hilariously heartfelt and enjoyable. Although there are moments where Anderson does delve into dark territories, it never completely outweighs the light tone. The character of Max is possibly my favourite character in any of Anderson's movies, a character that despite an almost snobbish intelligence is also incredibly emotionally immature. The film shows him coming to terms with his immaturity and growing up while also accepting his youth. Visually, the film is incredible, showing Anderson coming into his own and experimenting with many of the visual motifs that would become a staple of his filmography. The framing of the film using stage curtains to present the action adds this incredible sense of theatricality which parallels the story perfectly. The characters are all incredibly quirky and played terrifically by their respective actors. The writing is just as awkward and quirky as you'd expect it to be, and the music, which comprises entirely of British invasion music from the 60s, links in well with the rebellious tone that a lot of the film captures. While this isn't the most original or groundbreaking coming-of-age comedy, it's one that I really adore. If I could only ever watch one movie for the rest of my life, this would be one of the ones I consider picking before killing myself, because that would actually be torturous. But that's all well and good, you may be saying, but I only watch French movies. I don't like any movies that aren't French. Well, have I got the movie for you. Amelie at this point is probably the most famous example of French cinema, and there's good reason for that. This film is great. If you love the eccentric, whimsical feeling of Wes Anderson, then this is the perfect film for you. Jean-Pierre Jeunet is a director who has always had a really interesting, unique, and at times batshit insane style. He directed Alien Resurrection, which although isn't great, is easily the craziest and strangest movie in that franchise. And despite Amelie being a very simple romantic comedy plot-wise, in execution it couldn't be any more complex. Visually, the movie is one of the most colourful and bright live-action movies I've ever seen. Jeunet does a great job of making Paris feel eccentric. There are so many strange supporting characters that are constantly hilarious to watch and really memorable. There are endless amounts of creative, cartoony jokes that somehow fit into the world he creates perfectly. The film starts off with a goldfish that constantly tries to commit suicide, which I think perfectly sums up the tone of the movie. It can be quite dark, but it's also very light and really unbelievably sweet and charming. Audrey Tautou is marvellous in the title role, and I love the joyous nature of her character. The film is just generally as energetic, quirky and joyful as movies come, although I'm not sure that graphic time-lapse of a woman giving birth was really needed, but that's a thing that's in this movie right at the beginning. But do you know what is needed? More good Adam Sandler movies. Adam Sandler is a great actor when he tries, and my next pick, Punch Drunk Love, directed by Paul Thomas Anderson, is probably the perfect example of this. In Punch Drunk Love, Adam Sandler doesn't play a new or different character for him. He kind of plays the character he plays in most of his movies. He plays a really socially awkward character who has a habit of exploding in violent outbursts, but man, he plays it so damn well in this movie. The film succeeds so well because of how strange its characters are. Seeing this love story evolve from two characters who instantly click despite being so complicated and odd, it feels real. This is one of the most realistic romance movies I've ever seen because these characters characters actually feel like real people. You don't feel like you're watching two characters being thrust together because it's convenient to the plot. You feel like you're watching a genuine connection between two people. And that comes down to not just the fantastic performances from Sandler and Emily Watson, but also the fantastic direction and writing from PTA, who is absolutely on top form here. The film is constantly bizarre and funny. It's so distinctly PTA that I don't think anyone else could have made it this good. Visually, there are so many great moments and shots that have burnt their way into my head. Remember a couple years ago when Uncut Gems came out and everyone said it was the most stressful movie they've ever seen? Well, Punch Drunk Love is probably just as stressful. PTA manages to put you in the shoes of the character to the point where you feel all of his anxieties about everything surrounding him, but it only makes the film's resolution feel that much sweeter. John Bryan's score only makes the film feel purer as well. The song he wrote for the movie Here We Go is one of my favourite songs and absolutely beautiful and perfectly sums up the themes of the movie. This is one of the best romantic comedies ever made and quite possibly my favourite PTA movie, which, considering how many masterpieces he has under his belt, says quite a lot. Another good romance movie is 2013's Her, directed by Spike Jonze. Her is probably going to be one of the more controversial picks on this list, not because it's not good. I don't think anyone would disagree with the fact it's like one of the greatest movies ever made, but because it's one of the most emotional movies I've ever seen. But the beauty of this movie is that I find anytime I'm in a bad place emotionally or mentally, this film is like the warmest hug in the world. But at the same time, if I'm feeling really great, then it's the most depressing movie in the world. Anyone who has ever felt lost and lonely post-breakup will completely relate to this movie. No other movie has captured the feeling of fixing a broken heart or picking yourself up at the end of a depressive state quite as well as this film has. The film is constantly tender and vulnerable, only accentuated by the career best performance from Joaquin Phoenix. Jones's screenplay is absolutely genius, blending comedy, drama and sci-fi together perfectly, constantly blending pure emotion with warmth and comfort in the most intimate and inventive way possible. The film is almost 10 years old now, but still feels incredibly modern to the point where it only gets more and more relevant as it goes on. And that's the sign of a truly great movie, one that not only ages well, but just gets better with age. The film actually reminds me a lot of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, written by Spike Jonze's old collaborator Charlie Kaufman. Similarly, that film is a tender, beautiful movie that really picks me up if I'm feeling low. However, although that's like the top 3 favorite movie of all time for me, I decided not to pick it for this list because I feel like that one's a lot more full on and I could see people just considering it flat out depressing. Whereas this movie, although I can also understand people considering it really depressing, I personally think it can be really sweet. And do you know what else is sweet? Oranges. You know what oranges make? Marmalade. Why am I doing this fucking bit again? You know who likes marmalade? My boy, Paddington. The Paddington movies should have sucked. Time and time again, we've seen movie adaptations of classic children's books or cartoon characters, and they've just been terrible. But the Paddington movies work because they completely understand who the character is, and they do everything they can to capture his charm. Paddington Bear is an incredibly charming and sweet character, and if you don't capture that, then the whole film suffers. But Paul King clearly spent a lot of time perfecting it. Ben Whishaw's vocal performance is terrific, and he adds a real clumsy, whimsical tone to the character which makes him undeniably lovable. There are multiple comedic set pieces throughout these movies that capture the awkward, naive nature of the character, which I find so hilarious. They remind me heavily of the old Mr. Bean TV show in the comedic timing and simplicity. Both movies are incredibly fun and heartwarming. They're delightfully simple and sweet, never overcomplicating the character or trying to make him cool with the kids like I feel like a lot of similar adaptation would have done. The films feel modern yet timeless at the same time. Both films put Paddington in a big adventure to justify it being a cinematic movie rather than a TV short, but they also understand the limits of the character and what can and can't be done with him. There's never a point where they try and make it super cinematic or epic. Even despite the second second movie's train chase sequence at the end, it still feels light and kind of in keeping with the character. The second movie is well known for its widespread critical acclaim, including briefly being the highest rated movie on Rotten Tomatoes until some heartless cunt gave it a negative review last year. The second movie also, interestingly, is filled with anti-Brexit subtext, which only adds to its genius. Both movies are funny, sweet, and heartwarming. They're the perfect movies for the family, and I love them more every time I watch them. For me, I think both movies are basically the same in terms of quality, but the second one slightly wins me over due to having an incredibly beautiful ending. If it's good enough for Nick Cage, then it's good enough for everyone else. I'm gonna end this list on the most recent film of the bunch, a movie that only came out a few months ago, but one that I and everyone else in the world instantly fell in love with, and one that I would honestly already consider to be one of my all-time favourite movies. Everything Everywhere All at Once, directed by the Daniels. EIO is one of the most ambitious and large-scale movies in recent times, tackling incredibly deep and powerful themes of existentialism and nihilism, while blending every genre of film together in the world. The film is on the surface a comedy fantasy, but it blends action, science fiction, animation, and martial arts films in a way that never feels overly bloated. This is a 2.5-hour movie and it uses every second of its runtime perfectly. It's a very expressive and elaborate movie that is super close to being a sensory overload, but manages to stand right on the edge. The film does a great job of exploring the limitless of multiverses and experiments with the possibilities that can be opened up by it. The recent Doctor Strange movie also explores the multiverse, but it felt kind of underwhelming in terms of the opportunities they had to go crazy with it. However, this movie runs super far with it. So many sequences in this film are completely unlike anything I've ever seen, and at the same time the Daniels reference and parody other movies in a really interesting and at times surprisingly emotionally powerful way. There's a sequence that parodies the intro to 2001: A Space Odyssey in a way that works regardless of whether you've seen that movie. A lesser movie would have had the joke just be that, oh, we're referencing this, oh look, it's this thing you know. But the Daniels clearly understands the shallowness that referenced humour can contain. The comedy hits incredibly hard due to how imaginative and unpredictable it is. There's insane attention to detail throughout every sequence in this movie, but as the film goes on it becomes so incredibly heartfelt and emotional. The last half an hour of the movie is a complete sensory and emotional overload. Despite many ridiculous moments in this section of the movie, there's so much heart and emotion it's impossible to not even be slightly moved by it. The film is so masterfully created and is made by people who are masters of the art of cinema and storytelling. If anything was done slightly different, then the film could have straight up sucked, but everything feels so perfect and well groomed. I saw it twice within the opening week and I had to stop myself from going to see it a third time. If I had endless time and money, I probably would have gone to see it like every single day it was out. It's a movie that I can see myself returning to endlessly anytime I'm not feeling good about myself or life. It's the true definition of a comfort movie. Despite its emotional moments, it really comes together as a reassurance of life and the decisions we make. It's easily the best movie of the year and I highly doubt anything will come close to it. The beauty of cinema for me is I feel like it can be the most comforting piece of escapism possible. Sometimes when you've had a terrible day or week, there's just nothing like switching your mind off and having a piece of art or media there to pick you up and kind of take you to a completely different world. Everyone will have different comfort movies and maybe some of my picks aren't ones that others would pick, but if my picks were the same as everyone else's, then this video would have been incredibly boring. I mean, I'm sure it was anyway, but it would have been even worse. Let me know what your comfort movies are, and maybe if I've not watched them, I'll check some of them out. Thanks for watching this video till the end. It was a lot of fun to make, and I'll see you next time.